Hey everybody, how's everybody doing today? Welcome to my photography chat live stream where we come together as a community and talk about photography. And as always, I usually like the audience to drive the conversation. And if you have any topics you want to talk about or have any questions, you can leave them in the chat section and I'll do my best to answer them. But today I wanted to also focus on my bird and flight settings and birding with the OM-1. I'm shooting with the OM-1 Mark 1. But any settings I share with you today will be very, very similar on the OM-1 Mark II and also the OM-3 for that matter. There's some very, very subtle changes between the models. But that said, you know, I've been promising a bird and flight type settings video for a while now. And, every time I go out, I tweak the settings a little, I tweak the settings a little, and I wanted them to be perfect for when I make the video. So, that's part of the goal of this live stream. So I think I'm about 99% there. So I thought I'd go ahead and share with you live my bird and flight settings for different types of birding and a little bit of the experience I've had. And, also get some feedback because you guys always have some great tips and recommendations as well that I might be able to include in my upcoming videos. So if you have any good suggestions as we go along, feel free to leave them in the comments as well. So that said, good to see everyone here. I see Jeff is here and Marsha's here and JP Steiner, Thomas. Good to see everyone and Darko. And let me just hit the chat section real quick and see if there's anything in particular I can answer up front, and then we'll get into my settings and talk about birding with the OM-1. So Darko says, I put the 18-400 on the Z7. The Tamron lens is DX, so I get 600 millimeter reach. And the Z7 in animal detect mode, the F works pretty good, but in large box AF mode, it's better. Okay. I'm not that familiar with the Nikon autofocusing systems and what to recommend there, but it's good to hear that you've already figured out that the animal detect is not as good as just using large box. And the Z2 is obviously, Z52 is better than the Z7 with some old school fieldcraft. Does the job with the 200-500 Nikon lens. 45 megapixels has some great cropping ability for the birds on a stick. Yep. You'll definitely get more detail with the high resolution sensor. I have a Sony 60 megapixel, a Fuji 40 megapixel, and then I have all my OM systems 16 and 20 megapixels. And when you really pixel peep down to 400 or 500%, you will see a difference. And that's not uncommon when you need to crop. But, for the most part, when you have to start cropping too much, it's just going to be a normal picture. It's not going to be, have a lot of detail, I think, regardless of the sensor that you're using. At least that's what I found, because a lot of times the lens that you put onto it doesn't really resolve all the megapixels anyway, so you end up with basically the same image. And however, one day I think the OM-1 Mark II will be my birding kit. Yep, it's an excellent system. I just watched a video of a guy comparing his Nikon Z8 with the OM-1 Mark II. I don't think he talked about the lenses he was using, but he came up with kind of the same conclusion. He takes the OM-1 out for most things because of the smaller, lighter package. And he found that for bird on a stick and just about everything else, the image quality is pretty much the same. He said he does get better detail with his bird in flight images, though. But again, I don't know what lenses he was using, because that make a big difference. If he's just using a 75-300 kit lens compared to, say, a 600 millimeter f4 with the Nikon, it's not really a fair comparison. But I'll just assume that he was using pro lenses on both, quality lenses, and that was his conclusion. But I see a mixed bag of reviews. There's a lot of comparisons done between these high resolution cameras versus, say, our 20 megapixel camera. And the consensus, my gut feeling is the consensus was that high resolution will give you more detail, right? Plain and simple. And Douglas says, thought I would share this since I'm heading towards work today and we'll catch the live stream on the flip side. Robin, I'll have a great weekend. Thanks, you too. One last thing, the Z7 is going for about 700 Canadian, and it's truly a great deal used for those who want higher megapixel for cheap. Yeah, and it depends what you're going to be doing with the camera, right? I think the high resolution cameras typically are going to be slower in the frames per second. The workflow is going to be a little bit more tedious because the file size will be much larger, and it's really better suited for landscape, portrait, art reproduction, things like that. For sports action wildlife, I think you're fine with the lower resolution camera. And good morning, Tom. And good morning, Rob from Tampa. And George, good to see you. And Thomas, as always, hello. Okay, let's see. And Jeff and David Black from Southern Indiana. All right, and Ovid, good to see you. And George says, are you aware that YouTube ads cut off the very beginning of this chat? No, I'm not aware of that. But usually it's just kind of greetings and salutations in the beginning. So not much to miss there. What I'll do is I'll just lead every stream with about 30 seconds of just a screen, right? And not start talking. So that's I'll do that going forward. And 55 Whiplash says, I never thought I'd try Sony, but the A6700 with the 7-350 is very light and has great AF. Yeah, I'm sure it does. Sony's always had great autofocus, and that's their flagship APS-C camera. I've never used it, but I'm sure it's perfectly fine. And the settings I'm going to talk about today are going to apply to, generally speaking, the fundamental settings are going to apply to really every camera, and even more so if the cameras have any sort of bird detect or animal detect built in. It'll be even closer. And, then there'll be the nuances of how each autofocus system works. But the autofocus in OM systems is pretty straightforward. You select bird, right, for bird detect. And then there's two other settings like sensitivity and speed. Generally, I like the sensitivity to between, it can be plus or minus 2. I like to usually set it at 0, sometimes plus 2. It depends on the situation, but by default, I think just leaving it at 0 is perfectly fine. And the speed, when it comes to speed, is how fast it's going to focus from point A to point B. I believe that's the other setting. We'll double check. Like I said, I'm about 99% there. These other little fine tuning things are going to be a little bit more based on, the kind of birding that you do. And that is funny, right? So ironic. Okay, so let me just tell you the core settings, and then we'll go into the camera. Let's see if I did this right. That's not showing the camera, is it? I thought I had all this set up. Camera should be showing right now. What is going on? That's the camera button. Why isn't it showing? Let me think. This is plugged in. That should be showing. God, going live is... Oh, I know what's wrong. I know what's wrong. Okay. let me do this. I have to, okay, we should be live again. All right, so I'm going to bring the camera over here, and let's see. I think I can raise this up a bit just to make things a little easier. So you can see what I'm going to be talking about. Going to arrange. All right, so I have the OM-1 here. This is the Mark 1. And right now, what you're looking at, if you look like over here, right? Right here, I'm in manual mode, and I've programmed custom mode C1. So technically, I'm in custom mode C1 on the mode dial here, and I'm in C1. And these are the default settings to start with. So the core settings are shutter speed, right, which is right here. Shutter speed is at 1/3200th of a second, and the aperture is going to be wide open to whatever lens you have. So if you have like the 300 millimeter f4, it's going to be f4. If you have the like the 75 to 300, it might be like f4.7. If you have the 40 to 150 or the 150 to 400, it's going to be f 4.5 or something like that, right? So whatever is the widest aperture or the lowest number, f number, that's going to be the default here. So you need to make sure that's where that is. And then you'll also notice over here I have it's set to auto ISO as default. Okay, now I'm going to expand on this because we're not going to use auto ISO when we're actually taking pictures. We're going to manually control the ISO. And then here I have the white balance fixed to 5300 Kelvin, which is, just standard daylight. Natural color profile over here. Center weighted averaging. This is kind of irrelevant because we are going to be controlling full manual, the shutter speed and the ISO. And we're in SH2, which is high speed continuous focus with continuous autofocus. So you need to be in SH2 if you want the camera to focus while it's continually snapping off the shutter. Video, I have set the 4K 60 10-bit. I just have this as a default because I do post-process my images, but select the video mode that you think is best if, because sometimes, you want to just do a quick, 1 or 2 minute recording of a bird flying or bird on a stick, whatever. You can just quickly do a quick recording. And then I have dual card slots, and I have them both set to RAW. And this is just telling me here, the number 1 is telling me that card slot 1 is recording video, and I have an hour and 12 minutes of video left room on the card, at the 4K 60. So this time here will change based on whatever, how much memory space you have on your SD card. And then you'll also notice over here, I have an up arrow, then 1 equals 2, and then 3,638. So what that's telling me is I have a maximum of 3,638 images on card slot 1. Card slot 2 could be empty, or it could be the same, but depends on your workflow. But generally speaking, if you format both cards before you start shooting your birds, then this is going to be the maximum number of pictures you can take. This number is capped at 9,999. You can put more than that. I've put 12 to 13,000 images on a card, but the counter here stops at 9,999. Now this up arrow with 1 equals 2, what that means is that it's going to save the same RAW file to both cards at the same time, so you have a backup on card slot 2. However, if card slot 1 fills up, then card slot 2, you can still write to card slot number 2, even after card slot number 1 fills up. Now, if you have the same memory card in both slots, two 256 gig cards, then this number is not going to make, you can just look at this number and get an idea of how many shots you have left. But let's say you have like a 64 gig card in slot 1 and a 256 card slot in slot 2. The 64 gig will fill up pretty quickly, but it can continue to write to card slot number 2. You're just not going to have any backup. So that's why I chose these settings here. And then of course we have the Bluetooth is turned on and 98% battery life. So these are the core settings. These are settings I think, oh, and I'm sorry, I missed one other thing. Right here is the I have bird detect turned on. So these are the core settings that are really applicable to almost any camera. Shutter speed, aperture, auto ISO, continuous shutter with continuous autofocus, high-speed continuous shutter, I should say, and then dual memory card slots with bird detect. Now, if your camera doesn't have bird detect, like the OM-5, for example, and the M5 Mark III, you're not gonna have bird detect, but everything else you can use as far as settings go on the camera. So let me stop here and just see if there's any questions up to this point. Xmeta says try birds in flight with a K3. I have tried that. It's tricky. And Butters Gatto is here. Good to see you. And Juan and Xmeta. Yes, have the blue rectangle overlay above whole midsection. Okay. And then playing YouTube on alternate browser, get rid of ads. Example would be DuckDuckGo. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. But okay. Oh, focus area. Okay, so let's go into the super control panel next, okay? So on the super control panel, all of the settings I just showed you are here in the super control panel as well, except for focus point, right? I have that set to C1. And C1 meaning custom mode 1 for the autofocus. That's not the same as the custom mode 1. It's not the same as this custom mode 1 manual mode. This is for the focus points. This is also my default setting. So I'll explain that and show you how to do that, why I'm doing that. But these are the basic settings. And then what you do is you just, assuming you're in manual mode, you would do all these settings when you're in manual mode. But you can go into the menu, go over here, custom mode, set, assign, and set. Like that, and set again. So now everything I just have has been saved to custom mode C1. So if you've been following along, that'll get you the core settings, but I wouldn't save these custom modes quite yet. There's a lot of other individual settings in the menu that we need to go through. So why don't we do that real quick? So let me go back to the camera. We'll go into the menu. And I'm going to move my screen over. Give me 1 second. I'm going to move this over here. I'm moving screens around real quick so it's easier for me to see and explain what's going on. All right, so setting menu number 1. Okay, we're going to be in RAW. Detailed settings, you can ignore this because we're forcing it to be RAW right here. Image aspect, image review off. This is important. Make sure this is turned off. Okay, what this does is every time you take a picture, the camera shows you the picture that you just took. And this is really interrupts the workflow when you're birding particularly in high-speed continuous shutter. I also turn off shading compensation, because what I'm trying to do, and what the whole theme is here as we go through these settings, is to minimize the workload on the camera's processor so that it can focus on just doing bird subject detect autofocus. We don't want the camera to really have to worry about a bunch of other things. And you'll see that that'll be kind of the common theme as we're going along. So on the next page, picture mode, just standard, natural. We can ignore that. We've set the white balance to 5300K. And I turned off keep warm colors. I turned off flash white balance and color space sRGB. We're shooting in RAW, so again, this setting, the keep warm color, these settings are pretty much irrelevant when it comes to RAW files. And then on the next page, for the auto ISO, you want to set this between the maximum, which in my case is 12,800, and the base ISO of 200. This is the maximum range for auto ISO. And then the lowest shutter speed, you can leave that to auto. ISO auto in all modes, that's fine. ISO step, I set to 1 EV. Okay, you can set this to, whoops, I'm sorry. You can set this to 1/3 or 1 EV. So what this is if you look at the ISO down here, right? When I have it set to one stop EV, it's going to step 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 32. So it just jumps in full stops, okay, with the exception of ISO 80. It jumps in full stops versus, say, if I had set this to 1/3, right? Now if I rotate the front dial, you can see it's stepping. So we got 400, then we got 500, then 640, then 800. So it takes 3 clicks. So it steps in 1/3 of a stop. So it takes 3 clicks between each stop. So 800, 1000, 1250, 1600. So you have to roll the front wheel quite a bit to get all the way up to ISO 12,800. So I change this setting here to full stops so that I don't have to turn the dial quite as much. I can just turn it a few clicks and I can get very quickly and move in full stops. Because moving in full stops is fine, right? You might be thinking, oh, I want to just kind of tweak it a little bit. Trust me, you have 2 stops of wiggle room in your raw images. So jumping being off by 1 stop in your settings, in your ISO, is not going to make much difference when you're post-processing your images. And again, I should have said, I'm assuming you're shooting in RAW. If you're shooting in JPEG, that's really a whole different way to shoot birds, because you have to be very, very conscious of exposure, because JPEGs don't have a lot of wiggle room. Highlights can clip easily. Shadow areas can get noisy. So we're going to be shooting in RAW, and that's why I have this set to full stops. Okay, so continuing on. Let's see, where's my... All right, and then noise filter off. Okay, this really has to do with slow shutter speeds. So that's kind of irrelevant, but just turn that off. Low ISO priority, I just put it in drive priority. I want the camera to not spend any time processing images. Now this again applies to JPEGs. It's kind of a irrelevant setting, but just set it to drive priority versus, say, detail priority. And then noise reduction, I also turn that off. Again, noise reduction is for your JPEGs, not for your RAW files, but I turn it off because it does actually applies noise reduction to the JPEG file that gets embedded in your RAW image. Because your RAW image, your RAW file has a small JPEG embedded into it. And whatever settings you have for your JPEG are going to get processed and embedded into the RAW file. for preview purposes. You know, the thumbnail that you see on the back of your camera or the image you see on the back of your camera, that's a JPEG that's inside the RAW file. So again, I'm trying to minimize any additional processing the camera has to do that might slow it down for any reason. So that's why I turned that off. Okay, let's go to the next page here. Flicker scan, turn that off. That's important. Now EV step, this is for your shutter speed. Okay, so right now I do have this set to 1/3 because you can select 1/3, 1/2, or 1. I do have this set to 1/3. So if we look at the shutter speed right here, just right here where my finger is, I'm going to roll this in 1/3 of a stop. So 3 clicks. So if I'm at 1,000, 3 clicks should put me at 2,000. And I'm just rolling the wheel on the back here. The default setting, I have you starting at 1/3200th of a second. Okay. So let's go back into the menu. And we were here. Okay, exposure shift. You can leave this, whatever, all 0. This is irrelevant because we're shooting in full manual. And then let's go to the next page. The metering page is this first line item again is irrelevant because we are shooting in full manual. Metering during AEL, again, irrelevant. Auto reset, this is irrelevant as well. Now, yeah, this is irrelevant as well because again, we're shooting in full manual. But I'm leaving this to yes for a specific reason. So this is actually an important setting in some situations, even though we're shooting in full manuals. So I'll explain that when we go into the actual workflow of shooting in the field. And then metering during continuous shutter. You definitely want this turned off. Okay, again, this is related to, it kind of conflicts with the line above it, but yeah, definitely make sure this is set to no. And spot metering, again, is irrelevant because we're shooting in manual. And then flash, all of these settings are irrelevant. We don't need to worry about this. And then drive mode, we set this in the super control panel, SH2. Anti-flicker, if for some reason this is not grayed out, make sure this is turned off, because this will slow your camera down in other shutter modes. So you want to make sure this is turned off just in case you change out of SH2 to something else. You want to make sure this is turned off because this will slow your camera down. Sequential shooting settings. Let's go into this menu. Now in here, you can turn on and off via these checkboxes what shutter mode you want available to you. Now for birding, I turned everything off except for SH2, and SH2 can be set to 50 frames per second with the pro lenses. With most of the pro lenses, of course, except the one I'm showing you today. But if I have my 300mm f4, you have an option to go 50 frames per second. All you can see now is 25 because of the lens I have. Also make sure frame count limiter is turned off. This has screwed me over a few times until I figured out what was happening. My camera would stop taking pictures because I had a frame count limiter on there. So make sure that's turned off. Okay, so let's go back out. And I've turned off Pro Capture SH1. Pro Capture SH2 I have checked. And you'll see here, whoops, I'm sorry. Let's go into this, and I'm going to click the right arrow on my D-pad. Whether this is set to 25 frames per second or 50 frames per second, my pre-shutter frames I set to 15 frames because that's about, that's a fraction of a second, right? And that's about how long it takes for me personally to react to pushing the shutter button. So if I'm looking at a bird and I'm just waiting for it to move or do something, it's going to be typically, this is a bird on a stick, right? Ready to take off and fly. So you're just waiting for it and you're half pressing the shutter button. The camera's going to buffer 15 frames before you fully press the shutter button. So 15 frames is about how long it takes for me to react from the second that I see, the instant that I see the bird taking off, to me fully pressing the shutter button down. I will be able to capture the bird from the point that it's on the stick, and then at 25 or 50 frames per second as it takes off from the stick. So I'm going to make sure I capture all of that. Now, if you're a little bit slower on the trigger, you may want to bump that up, but not too much. I wouldn't do more than 25 frames, okay? Unless you have some other specific need. But for bird on flight, bird on a stick taking off, 15 frames per second for me. Go as high as 25. You can even go down lower. If you're really fast on the trigger, okay, you can go down to 10 frames or 5 frames. All right, but the idea being here is you want to reserve the maximum number of frames to the actual shooting of the bird flying. Okay, because you only need a few frames of the bird taking off as it spreads its wings to take off from the stick. But you want to capture a lot of frames of the bird flying toward you, ideally, right? Not away from you. You don't want a butt shot, right? But you want the bird flying toward you. You want to capture as many frames as possible. And if you pre-buffered 25 frames, right? If we go back here, if I have this set to the maximum, whatever that number is, yeah, I can pre-buffer a boatload here, whatever the max is. I'm not going to bother going all the way up there. What you're doing is you're taking away from the buffer in the camera, meaning my OM-1 has about a 90 frame buffer. So I'm dedicating 15 frames to the pre-shutter and then 75 frames to the buffer. So at 25 frames per second, that still gives me about 2.5 seconds of flight time, right, of mashing the shutter button down until the buffer fills up. Now in the OM-1, what happens when the buffer fills up is the camera continues to take pictures, but it slows down from, say, 25 or 50 frames per second. It slows down to about 5 frames per second. Assuming you have a UHS-2 card, you have to be using UHS-2 cards, okay, V60 or V90. V60 is more than fast enough for our cameras. The V90 cards are for like these high bit rate 8K video cameras. We don't care about that. All we care about is photography and birding, right? So basically the camera will slow down to about 5 or 6 frames per second, but it'll continue to shoot, okay? But that's why I set the pre-shutter buffer to the lowest number that I'm capable of mashing that shutter button quickly. So just be aware of that, because if I set that to 25 frames, let's say I set it to 75 frame pre-buffer. Okay, there's applications for that, but not for birding. If I set the pre-buffer, the pre-shot here to, the maximum, right? I'll be taking away, the minute that bird takes off and I mash the shutter button, my camera's buffering, and I'm only at 5 or 6 frames per second. Okay, you don't want that because you're going to miss a lot of images. So I'm sorry for dwelling on this on so long, but that's really important. This is a very, very important setting. And even more important than all of that is make sure the frame count limiter is turned off, because your camera will continue to take pictures even after the buffer is full. Okay, let's go back out. So these are the only 2 shutter modes that I use when I'm birding, SH2 and Pro Capture SH2. There are reasons for using these other shutter modes, okay? And this is what I meant when I said that, I've been trying to perfect this, but I just, no settings that I say are going to be perfect for everybody. I'm just showing you what's perfect for me and what works best for me. And I'll explain why I choose SH2 and I just explained the Pro Capture in depth. SH2 is the 25 or 50 frames per second. I want the camera to be capturing as many frames as possible, so I don't need to use any of the other shutter modes. I'm going to use SH2 because I want it to capture as many frames as possible when I'm birding. Even if it's a bird on a stick. Okay, if it's a bird on a stick, I'm still going to use SH2 because I'll tap the shutter button to take the picture of a bird on a stick, and it's going to capture, typically I get 5 or 6 frames from the time I push the shutter button and release it. That's about the fastest I can do, right? I get about 5 or 6 frames, even though I just kind of just mash the shutter button and let go. And that's okay, because sometimes what you can do, right, is I've been experimenting with taking, 10 frames of a bird on a stick. If it's not moving at all and there's no wind, 10 frames, I take those 10 frames that I captured because I used SH2 and I do focus stacking on them. And I get a really, you do extract just a tiny bit more detail. Now, the improvement in detail and everything, in my opinion, is really just academic. A single image really has more than enough. But if you like to do things like that, like I like to do that sometimes, see how much I can push and how much less noise I can get and how much more detail can I squeeze out. I want to squeeze every single pixel out of this camera. I'll shoot an SH2, capture about 10 frames of a bird on a stick, and then do focus stacking. Even though I'm not adjusting focus, right? I'll do focus stacking, and then I'll get a little bit more detail. And I've done examples of that in previous streams. But that's why I use SH2 and I don't bother with the other modes, is because I like to experiment a little bit with focus stacking to get more detail and less noise. And I also like to experiment. I want to capture as many frames as possible as quickly as possible. Okay. Now, what this does is when we go to the super control panel, I can switch to Pro Capture and back to, well, the timer modes stick around. So some of these modes do not go away. Single shutter, silent shutter. But yeah, I keep Pro Capture and SH2 right next to each other. Otherwise, I'd have to be scrolling through all those other different continuous shutter modes. So I turn off all of the sequential shooting ones here, except the 2 that I'm going to use for birds. Now for silent settings, these are my settings. Wait time, you got to make sure that's set to 0, noise reduction turned off. I like the beep sound when I'm shooting in silent mode, electronic shutter, personally. I like to hear that. Sorry, my Alexa just started talking to me for no reason. Alexa, stop. Of course it doesn't stop. All right, so anyway, I like the beep sound. And then AF illuminate turned off, flash mode, not allow. Okay? But some people just like completely silent operation. You can turn that off. Image review, very important. That needs to be turned off. These are grayed out, and that's fine. And erase all. We don't need to worry about that. Oh, wait. Sorry. I was in my menu. These are my menu. These are my custom menus. Because when I was trying to come up with the perfect settings, I was experimenting with all these different things. Let's go back into, God, I'm so sorry. We're a little bit out of order here, but let's go back to, we were here, we did this, we did this, we did drive mode. Okay, self-timer settings are relevant. Anti-shock settings, turn that off. Silent settings, I just talked about this. Now let's go into the next one. Image stabilizer. SIS auto. Now this is what was recommended by the OM ambassadors that I met with a couple of weeks ago, or as recently as a couple of weeks ago. And also I've been on the OM system live streams where they have those AMA or Ask Me Anythings. And they also said, just use SIS auto, okay? And what this does is it automatically detects motion, right? And for panning as well. So if you're panning, the camera's internal gyroscopes will adjust for that. Now, there's an argument to be made where when you have your shutter speeds right? At like 1/3200th of a second or 1/4000th, 1/5000th, when you have shutter speeds this high, there's an argument to be made that you don't need uh, image stabilization at all. And I can tell you, I have shot like at 1/4000th, 1/3200th, even at 1/2000th of a second with image stabilization intentionally turned off to see if there was any difference. And in the final image itself, generally speaking, particularly like at 1/4000th of a second, I didn't see any difference in the image quality. In fact, some people would argue that the image stabilization might even make the image a little bit worse, right? Now, I haven't been able to consistently reproduce problems of having that turned on or off, so I'm not going to go into that. But I have seen situations where there's no reason for that image to be a little bit blurry. And the only thing I can think of is because I had image stabilization turned on at very high shutter speeds. I can't think of anything else that would cause that. But I'll leave that up to you. For those of you that are more experienced in birding, I know you like to turn off the image stabilization. For me, why I like to leave the image stabilization in SIS Auto is when I have pressed the shutter button, right? It stabilizes the image, particularly for bird on a stick. But for any kind of tracking and following a bird or bird on a stick, when you're like at 300 millimeters or higher, like I'm typically at 420 millimeters with the teleconverter, which is an 840 millimeter, full frame equivalent, it's really hard to hold the camera steady and get focus lock or track anything because everything's so shaky in the EVF when I'm trying to track a bird or take a picture of a bird on a stick. So that's why I leave image stabilization off, even though ultimately I might have some images that would have been sharper if I had image stabilization turned off. I don't know anybody at OM Systems or any of the ambassadors that will tell you this, right? They'll say, just leave it on auto. They never had any problems. My experience is sometimes I see images that I think should have been sharper. And I'm not going to count it to missing focus. I'm pretty sure there's something with the image stabilization. But anyway, enough of that. Okay, so let's go back into what we were on page 7, page 8. So SIS Auto, image stabilization, frames per second priority. If this is grayed out right now, but if it's not grayed out, you want to make sure this is on frames per second priority because there's two settings here. It's because of the mode I'm in. If I get this out of Pro Capture and just put it back in SH2, let's go back to page 8. Yeah, now, oh, it's still turned off. But sometimes this will say frames per second priority or image stabilization priority. I generally like this to be on frames per second priority because this lets the camera continue to shoot even though it's not sure about the status of the image stabilization. Again, it's all about speed when you're talking about birding. It's all about speed because birds are fast, especially the small ones. They're really fast, and I don't want to miss a shot, because chances are it is in focus, right? But the camera wasn't sure, so it didn't take the picture. Whether it's the image stabilization or focus, and there's another setting in the autofocus menu that we need to get to, but I think that'll be coming up here. So let me make sure I didn't miss that though. I thought that was, oh yeah, it's in the autofocus menu. All right, image stabilization turned on with the shutter button. So when you have pressed the shutter button, this is what I was talking about earlier, stabilizing the image in the EVF when you're looking through the EVF so that you can compose your shot and make sure the focus point is on the bird. Handheld assist and lens IS priority all turned off. All right, let's go to computational modes. We can ignore this entire page 1, 2, and 3. None of this matters. All right, in the autofocus menu, it's continuous autofocus. You have continuous autofocus with tracking. Honestly, the autofocus with tracking is not that great in the OM system cameras. This works well for like doing portraits, people's faces, you know, and they're moving around while you're taking their picture. This works great, but for birding, forget it. But by default, I'm going to set this to continuous. Autofocus plus manual focus, I turn off because I don't do any manual focusing when I'm doing birding. It's just too slow of a process for me. Birds move too quickly. We can ignore starry sky. Autofocus by half pressing, yes. Half pressing the shutter button. In CAF and SAF, that's fine. So when I half press the shutter button, the camera's going to focus. AF on in manual focus mode. Actually, I like this to be on. I missed one. I like this to be on just in case, so that I can have the camera at least get close with the autofocus, and then I just do manual focus to fine tune if I'm going to manual focus, which I never do. So for me, this setting's irrelevant, but for some of you, this might be handy to have this turned on. Okay, now release priority. For single point autofocus, where the camera focuses once and then takes the picture, I have the release priority turned off because this tells the camera, don't take the picture if you don't have focus, right? So I think in SAF, this is perfectly fine, but in continuous autofocus, I have this turned on. So what this does is, whether the camera thinks it has focus or not, because the camera can tell you if it thinks it has focus, because you get the green dot or you get that beep sound, right? Like I leave the audio turned on. It's not going to take a picture if you have that setting turned off, like this. It's going to wait until it thinks it has autofocus. Again, I don't want to miss any shots. The camera will continue to try to acquire focus whether this is turned on or off. The only difference is when this is turned on, the camera will take pictures immediately after you push the shutter button, whether it thinks it has focus or not. And in continuous autofocus, again, you don't want to miss any shots, so make sure this is turned on. In single autofocus, you're taking one picture at a time typically, so why not have this turned off? But okay. All right, and then let's go back out. And illuminator off, AF area pointer to on 2. So I like on 2. Some people find this distracting. What this does is, I'll see if I can demo this for you. So right now I have it set to on 2. You see those little green dots that come up? That's what on 2 does. It puts those green dots. But if I go into, let me go back to the menu. If I have this set to on 1, you get the autofocus frame, the red grid there, right? The red grid that you see right there. And then we can turn this completely off. Oops. Heck, I don't know what the heck the difference is between off and on 1. Let's just say for now, there's so many things in this camera. Let's just say for now, on 2 displays the green dot, and then on 1 and off do not display. I just turned this off. Why are the green dots showing? Did I do it or not? Hold on. Let me go into the menu. There. When I turn this off, the green dots do not show. Okay? So we want this to be, I like it on 2. Okay, me personally. because I like to see where the camera's focusing. Because just because, all right, now just because we have this white square around the bird doesn't mean the camera is focusing on the bird. You could have green dots up in here, in this area, even though you have a box over here. I've seen it, okay? You want to be, so I like to see the green bars. Also, if you look closely, right now it's focusing up near the eye, but there's green boxes all around the eye, right? So the camera could be focusing here on the bird's chest or on the top of the bird's head, and the eye will be slightly out of focus. Because look where all the green dots are. They're all over the place. Now, in this case, the bird is a little bit small in the frame. If I zoom in, now we're getting closer, right? Now we're closer to the eye. But this is why a lot of the shots aren't perfectly focused on the eye, because you have these green boxes everywhere. And it's focusing anywhere on one of those green boxes. Now, in theory, your depth of field will be enough that everything's going to be in focus in that little small area. But when you pixel peep, you can say, man, it just missed the eye just a little bit. You know what I mean? But most of the time it's okay. But sometimes you'll see that, right? It'll be off a little bit. It focused on the beak, or maybe it focused, towards the back of the bird's head, something like that. And it'll just misfocus a little bit. That happens quite a bit. And that's why I like to see the green box, right? It gives me an idea of how the camera is focusing. Okay, let's go back to the camera. Let me put my lens cap back on. Okay, let's go back into the AF menu. We were here on page 2, AF area pointer, face and eye detect. This may be a little bit different on the Mark II and the OM-3 because they combine the face detect and the subject detect into a single line item, so to speak. So, but in any case, we want subject detection to be set to bird and eye detection frame on. So that's the little box inside that's the white box that we saw. The little white box inside that was right on the eye of the bird. And I always like that turned on. It doesn't slow the camera at all down because, the camera is always looking for the eye and the bird, whether or not you have this turned on or off. So I always leave this on because I like to know that the camera did see the eye. It's just user experience and workflow. It helps me in the field. All right. Once we finish the AF menu, we have a couple more pages here. I'll go back to the chat section. So start asking your questions now about anything I've brought up to this point. And then we'll get into some of the other settings. And I'll answer some questions. Okay, so CAF sensitivity, I set this to 0. And again, you can go plus or minus 2. And then CAF center priority. Okay. This is a little tweak I've done since I've made these settings. I'm actually going to turn all of these off. Okay? That's what we really want. So let me go ahead and save that change. That's something I just decided today. Okay? This is a new setting. Remember when I said I was 99%? Well, now I'm 99.1% there. Okay, so let's go back to, we are on page 3. So I'm going to turn all of these off. All right, and I'll explain each of these here in a second. AF limiter right now is turned off, but these are not the default settings. I changed these. Okay, 0 to 10 meters, so I'm focusing on birds, bird on a stick that's relatively close. 10 to 100, this is for birds that are flying around, typically a little bit further away. And then 100 to 300 for just, if for whatever reason you want to try and take a picture of a bird 100 meters away, you can select on 3. Again, these are my settings. I change these in the field sometimes, depending on what I'm shooting. But these are the default settings that I use to get started. But I may change these in the field. But whenever I recall custom setting 1, this is what I want to see, my default settings. And again, release priority on. Okay, I don't know why it's here again, but make sure this is turned on. Okay, I don't see a need for it to be there twice because we changed this setting in the other menu. I don't know why it's here again. Okay, AF scanner turned on and focus adjustment turned off. I've never used this. There's a whole thread on this somewhere online about why you want to use this, but it's beyond me. All right, so let me talk about CAF sensitivity real quick. So plus or minus 2, right? So the idea here is, let me get a bird. Oh, actually, I might have it. I thought I saved those. Let me see. I did not save them. Maybe I can use these stickers. They sent me all these stickers from Viltrox. I'll grab this sticker and this sticker. Seriously, why would Viltrox send me stickers like this? I don't know why. I mean, what am I, 12? You know? I don't know. Anyway, so let's say we have a bird here, right? I have CAF sensitivity set to, actually I only need this one. And then I have this, let's say this is a tree. So the bird is flying behind the tree like this. If I have this set to +2, let's talk about the two extremes, +2 and -2. If I have set this to +2, what's going to happen when the bird goes behind the tree, the camera is going to focus on the tree very quickly. And then when the bird comes out, it's going to focus on the bird again. So this is a better example. Let's say my hand is a tree. As the bird goes behind the tree, the camera no longer detects the bird, right? And then it detects it again when it comes out behind the tree. During that time it goes behind the tree, the camera is going to focus on the tree. If I have it set to +2, it's going to change focus very quickly. It's going to be very sensitive to the subject or lack thereof. Now, if I have it set to -2, what's going to happen is the camera's going to be tracking the bird goes behind a tree, but it's not going to focus on the tree. It's going to maintain focus where it left off. So the bird is on a certain focal plane. It's going to maintain focus on the bird here. Although it doesn't detect the bird anymore, it's not going to change focus onto the tree. And when the bird comes out and it detects the bird again, it's going to see the bird and adjust the focus ever so slightly, whatever it needs to adjust, because the bird's not going to be on the same exact plane when it comes out. It's going to adjust slightly. So that's -2. So 0 is kind of in the middle. All right. So for me, personally, I just like to leave it at 0. But if you do a lot of woodland birding, you may want to change that to -2. So it doesn't change focus too quickly. So it's basically for when the camera loses focusing on whatever it's trying to track. Is it going to change focus quickly or is it going to wait? So you're just adjusting the sensitivity. So 0 is kind of middle ground. I don't know. I haven't tested it. You know, it's very hard to test things like that, right? As just a guy with a camera, right? But that's what I do. All right. Okay, center priority. I've turned, okay, as of today, because I went out again this morning, or actually I decided this yesterday. God, I'm mixing all these. I've been going out so much lately, but I've turned all these off. So what this means is, we have that green box represents the focus area. So when we say center priority, it's going to start, it's going to start, it's going to start the autofocus wherever that little plus sign is. So you see this little plus sign right here? It's going to start autofocus. I wish things would stay. It's going to start autofocus on the little plus sign. That's center priority. And then it's going to start looking around the frame. All right? I've turned it off because a lot of times the bird is not in the center of the frame. I don't want the focus to start looking there and then miss the bird when it flies somewhere else. I want it to look for the bird everywhere. Don't start in the center. Just look for the bird anywhere in that box that I've designated, because I could set it to C2, which is, kind of this wide frame, or all points, or a single point. Basically, I want it to look everywhere within the green box. Don't start in the center. Just look anywhere in there. Because, like I said, we're working with telephoto lenses, right? We're working with a telephoto lens, so a lot of times, even with stabilization, the bird is moving around in the frame a lot. It's hard to keep it in the dead center. So I don't want it to start in the center. I just want it to look anywhere in that frame for the bird and focus on it. Okay. Let's go to, whoops. Let's go back into the menu and go back to the autofocus menu, center priority, all of this. We talked about these. This is movie mode. This is irrelevant. This is where they have the CAF speed. If you're doing birding, I set this to fast. If for whatever reason you want to record a video of a bird, a clip of a bird, and again, sensitivity at 0 and CAF mode. Okay, target mode settings. So these are the target mode settings I've selected. All, single, cross, mid, large. I use all of these, and then I made 2 custom ones. So this is my custom one. So, and I also have a custom mode 2. I rarely use this, but I have sometimes. And then C3. So what you do is you click right on your D-pad, and then you rotate your front and rear dials to change the shape of the autofocus area. So this is a little bit like what I did for C1. So I selected I think I did something like this. This is my C1 setting. So all of those little gray dots that you see around are all the focus points, or points that the camera can focus. And what I'm telling the camera do by creating a custom target area is don't look at the ones that are outside of this yellow box. Only, oh, sorry. I might have to go answer the door. So what I'm doing is I'm telling the camera not to look at any of the focus points outside of this yellow box. So like I had that other one, C2. In this situation, I'm telling the camera to only try to focus on things that are inside of that yellow box and nothing outside of it. Okay. Whoops, sorry about that. Let me, I have to check the front door. I'm sorry, 1 second. Okay, I'm back. So where were we? I lost my place here. Let's go into the menu. We were talking about target points, right? Page 5. So that's how I programmed it. So let's say I want to make a new one for C3. For whatever reason, I want a vertical one, and I can save that. And that should now be an option here. So now I have C3, and now you'll see this, I can move this around using the joystick on the back. But okay, so that's what that does. Let me go back to, we were on page, let me go ahead and turn that off because I rarely need to shoot vertically like this. But there's some customizations that you can do. By default, I have it set to C1. So what this does, okay, is, again, all of the gray dots outside of that yellow box, the camera's not going to try to autofocus. So that gives the camera less work to do, right? Because now it only has to look at maybe 75% of the gray boxes rather than 100%. So this does improve your autofocus performance when you're trying to track birds, because now the camera's not looking everywhere, it's looking in more in the center area. My C1 is significantly bigger than the large, right? This is too small for birding. But this is just right in my opinion, because you think about it, the bird, okay, if you, where's my sticker? If the bird is, how come, oh, I gotta be over here. If the bird is here, it's not going to focus, it's not going to look for the bird here, it's not going to waste any processing time on the bird, right? That's less work for the camera to have to do. Now, as soon as the bird touches or goes inside, now the camera can detect the bird and it'll autofocus. Because think about it, if the bird is up here and the camera's wasting time trying to autofocus on a bird up here, you're only going to get the bird's feet or the back, a tip of the bird's wing. And that's, you don't need to waste time on those kind of shots, right? So you only want it if the bird is even just a little bit inside that yellow frame, it's going to try to autofocus on it. It's going to detect the bird. And of course, if it's inside the frame fully, it's going to have even more focus points to choose from, particularly if it's looking for the eye or the head of the bird. It's going to have more focus points to choose from. So I changed to this smaller C1 that I created on the recommendation of Lee Hoy from one of his videos or live streams that he's been on mine. And he said that this helps with the autofocus. And I can tell you, I'm getting better hit rate. I can't give you a number. I can't quantify it. It's just a gut feeling. But if an OM system ambassador tells me that this is better, and it's not affecting my photography in any way when it comes to birding, because I don't want a shot of a bird when it's way out here. First of all, it's too small, and even if the bird is close up, right? It's just, you don't want half a bird. You only want it when it's kind of in the frame and it's detected like that. So again, it's all about tweaking the camera so it has to do less work and capture the bird. Okay. So that's why I have C1. And then of course C2, if we look at C2, C2 is here. I moved the joystick around. But this is for birds that are kind of flying in a parallel pattern. I rarely use this. I've tried it on a few things and it works fine, right? But I rarely use that one, but I just wanted to show you another customization that might be useful to you, or demonstrate how it works, right? Because if the bird is, up here, maybe, maybe this is a tree line or something, or a fence, or maybe there's a fence down here, and the bird is, if the bird is flying down here in front of some trees or brushes or flowers, the autofocus is going to get really confused, right? It might see the bird, but more times than not, it's going to think this flower is a bird, or it's going to think, part of this bush is a bird, but it's not the bird. It's focusing on that instead. So you're narrowing the focus in an you're optimizing the focus area for where you want to capture the bird, where the background is relatively clear, or whatever, right? Okay. And then these things, oops, let's go over here, back to the AF. I have it set to jump to my menu quickly. That's why I have to keep, I have to keep jumping back and forth. Set home, I have it set to C1. So I don't have any home button programmed on as buttons on my camera. So it's really kind of irrelevant, but just out of best practice, if I want my default setting to be C1, I want my AF target mode to be C1. And AF target point, I want the C1 to be in the center, okay? Because target point, let me set this back to C1. Target point is where I'm moving the target point. I'm not changing the target area, right? The area is the big green box, but the target point I'm changing, and you can see it makes a difference. So I set the target point and the target area all to be kind of in the center. Or I want the target area to be C1 and the target point to be in the center. Okay, so let's go back to that page. Select, I can't remember what this is. Oh yeah, this is just the front and rear dial moves changes the focus mode, and the D-pad changes the position. So basically what we're talking about is the front and rear dials. The front and rear dial, if I go into my focus, the front and rear dial changes the focus or the target area, and the rear dial also changes the focus area, right? Sorry, I'm not being consistent there, but you can ignore that for the most part. Okay. Let's go back into the target menu. We're on page 5. Loop settings. This I turn this off because when I'm moving things around, I don't want it to loop around to the other side. Just turn this off. It's just easier. And honestly, I don't even know what this is. All will not be selected before moving the target area. All right, just set that to no. And then our AF targeting pad. If this is grayed out, that's fine, but I like it to be off. If for whatever reason yours is on green. So what this is like on the back of the screen, if I have the camera up to my face, right? I'm looking through the EVF, I can use my thumb to move the focus point. Okay, I've never gotten used to doing that personally. If you like it, you can turn it back on if that's an option. But I just typically use the joystick on the back of the camera to move the target point around, or the D-pad. Okay, and I think I got one last page, and then I'll go to the comments section to answer any questions. Okay, we're on AF mode page. Okay, so let's go to page 6. Yeah, this is for manual focusing. The only thing here is I make the clutch inoperative. Okay, this is the most important thing. These, whatever your personal preference is on these, this I make inoperative because I can't tell you how many times, like my 300 f4, the 12 to 40 Pro, they have this clutch, right? Where you can click it back and manually focus. All right, great for video work. But when I'm birding, things are happening too fast for me to stop and do this. And I can't tell you how many times I've accidentally clicked this and I ain't focusing on crap. Everything is out of focus because the autofocus is basically turned off and you're in manual focus because of this clutch. So I make sure I disable this so it doesn't matter. when I pick up my camera, I know I'm going to be in autofocus mode. Okay. And I think that's the end of the autofocus menu, and I will stop here and take any questions on that. So let me check the chat section, get this camera out of the way. Actually, I should plug in. Give me 1 second. Plug in the charger. Okay, so hopefully you guys had some good comments and questions here and suggestions for me as well. But that's where I'm at. All right, still some greetings here. I missed focus area. Okay, so if you can, if you want to ask me this question again and be a little bit more specific, let's see. And Marcia says, I already have C1 set up. If I want to change to your settings, do I hit set and it changes my setup? Yes. Whatever settings I'm recommending here, if you save it to C1, it's going to overwrite everything in your C1. Okay, and we still have a lot more settings to go through actually, but so Heather says yes, it'll overwrite your current settings, so she's confirming that. And Dan says, I might have missed it, but could you address your dial and function lever setting? Yes, I haven't gotten to that part yet, but I will go to that. Short answer is I assign lever position 1 to, basically I assign the lever to change the autofocus area. So C1, or lever position 1 is C1, that reduced green area box. And then C2, or lever position 2, is single point. Okay, so I switch between a big area and single point. C1, the large area, and single point. That's what I do with my lever position. But I'll go into the menu and show how that's set. And Heather says, what determines what is default and available in drive setting? By default, I think everything is turned on. So you go ahead and the sequential shooting settings, I'll show you that again real quick. Okay, my menu, I have sequential shooting settings right here. But it's in here. What page is it? Drive mode. Yeah, page 7, camera menu 1, page 7. Turning these on and off will add these to the super control panel. So let's say I want to add regular pro capture. Now if I go into super control panel, pro capture is there, right? And then if I go back into sequential shooting settings and turn it off, so you can see why I put this in my menu, because it is something I was being very selective about. But if I go back into the super control panel, you can see that these are gone. I think there's a way to turn off all these other ones too. I just didn't run across it in my settings. That might be something I want to tweak, but Pro Capture is gone. Okay, good question. Oh, never mind. Found out myself. All right, never mind. I should read a couple ahead just so I don't do that again. All right, I do everything with my Olympus camera except wildlife. I use my Sony for that. Their IF works really well. So I hear. I haven't tried it myself. I know my Sony, the IF works really well for humans. I don't have any long lenses for my Sony though. And that explains some of the focus issues, those green squares, at least I suspect so. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. You know, I'm guessing. I'm not the Olympus or OM system engineer that designed the autofocus system, but I can tell you from all the pictures I've looked at, that's the only explanation I can come up with. And then JP asks, is bird detect subject detection good if I'm a photographer? Bees, pollen. Bees getting pollen? Yes. Bird Detect actually does work pretty well for that. Um, it's not perfect though. It doesn't have as high a hit rate or detect bees quite as often as it might detect a bird because it's just not designed for bees. You could try Animal Detect as well. God, Chris McGinnis, the OM system ambassador that specializes in macro work and close-up photography, he told me which worked better, animal or bird, and I can't remember. So my suggestion is just try both bird and animal detect for bees and see, because he told me and then I forgot. I'm sorry. And the Gray Vanzini says the idea of center priority should be in all cameras. I would use it continuous more often. So again, for birding, I'm not enabling it anymore. I used to do that 99.9% of the time. In fact, if you watch my previous bird and flight videos, best settings and things like that, uh, I've changed some of those things. I've tweaked it even further. I know center priority is one of them. Continuous autofocus release on. All right. In my original breast settings for bird and flight, I had that turned off because my logic at the time was I don't want the camera to take a picture unless it thinks it has focus. My priority now, being a little bit more advanced than I was 2 years ago when I made that video, my priority now is just take the dang picture. I don't care if you think you have autofocus or not. I want it to start taking photos right away. And there are times when I know that I can see the thing is in focus with my eye, but the camera is not taking a picture. It's really frustrating. Um, so now I just leave that turned on. And I've heard from other bird photographers, they also like to leave that turned on, where it'll just take pictures whether it thinks it has focus or not. So I'm following what I think is best practice and also what my experience has been in the field over the last 2 years since I made my last video. And Heather says, I cannot change select some center off priority messages AF target mode settings. Okay. If you can't select it, don't worry about it. They may become available again once I go through all of the settings that I have for bird and flight. Off the top of my head, I can't think of why that would be the case though. Like I said, these cameras are so complicated. And Nerd Mike says, I think image stabilization, it's not related only to slow shutter speed. It helps to stabilize view and following subject with long lenses. Yes. So you and I agree on that. Because hopefully I elaborated and explained that, but that's exactly what I was trying to say earlier. If that wasn't clear, what Nerd Mike is saying is exactly what I was trying to say. Wow, I wish the OM-5 had that. Yep. I'm sure the OM-5 Mark III is going to have bird detect. It just doesn't make sense to make another camera without it, because every camera now has it. And Hikerdu says, thanks for the BIF settings. Would these work well for insects in flight, butterflies, where the background is likely to be busier, plants, leaves, than a clear sky? So I did try bird and flight settings for butterflies, and it doesn't recognize butterflies as well as it does birds, but it does recognize them when their wings are spread out. But the butterfly wings are so colorful sometimes it confuses the autofocus, right? So it's hit or miss, honestly. I would say for butterflies, it's probably half as good as it is for birds. So when you have it set to bird detect, the bird detect performance probably drops 50% if you're trying to do butterflies. And Heather says, I follow along and mimic your settings, but I still see small green boxes. Sorry, so many questions. It's okay. But I still see small green boxes. I'm not sure what you mean by small green boxes. So what we'll do, Heather, is I'm going to go through some more settings after I finish the questions here. And then I'm going to ask for very specific questions from each individual and try my very best to answer questions from individuals like yourself and resolve that, okay, before we go. All right. Because right now I'm not sure what you mean, which small group. If you're talking about the little autofocus points, I prefer them to be there, but if you want them turned off, then it's in that other setting where we had the on 1, on 2. You want to turn it off. Did I understand correctly? Only available on OM-1, not the OM-3. No, it's available on the OM-3. So OM-3, OM-1, OM-1 Mark II. These are the three cameras that the settings are very, very similar, almost identical with the exception of like where you do the bird detect selection and face detect. In the OM-1 Mark I, you have to turn off face detect and turn on subject detect. So I think by default, when you turn subject detect on, face detect gets turned off, but that's kind of the main difference. And Jeff says, if today's stream isn't a good reason to support Rob's channel, I don't know. Thanks, Jeff. You covered it. Okay, good, good. Can Super Control Panel be customized? I have the OM-1 original. My A7R4 allows customizing this similar panel. No, it cannot be. The closest thing we have is the custom menu, My Menu, where you can put a lot of the things that are in the Super Control Panel on the My Menu, which is, you know, this My Menu, and you can have multiple My Menus, right? This is number 1, but you can have number 2 and 3. You can put Super Control Panel stuff in here, but it's, yeah, as far as this goes, there's no way to change what's in here. You know, Fuji has something similar as well. They have a Q button, right, where you can just put the settings you want right in a Q button. I really like that feature. I hope OM System can add that. I do like that feature. It says, you're so thorough, even I followed. Okay, good. And Chris uses animal for bugs. Okay, thank you, Heather. So it was animal. All right. I appreciate that. And then you said the focus area small green boxes. Okay, so let me go back to that real quick. So it's in here. It's in, I believe it's in the AF menu. Yeah, AF menu page 2. Just turn that off. So now, let me take off the cap. When I turn that off, there's no little green focus boxes, right? Let me turn my shutter speed down. But if I turn this to, go to AF menu, page 2, turn this to on 2, and now I got the green boxes. Like I said, some people hate those things. I like them. I like them, but hopefully that answers your question. And JP, thank you so much for the super chat. I really appreciate that. You know, I do my best, and once I'm done with this video and I just kind of let everything I talked about soak in even more and maybe go out another couple of times and share with you or tweak the settings maybe a little bit more, then I'm going to make a video and I'm going to provide a file that you can download so you can put the same custom settings I have, because you can load the custom settings through OM Workspace and save them to your computer, and I can make that file available. Maybe I'll do that today during the stream, the settings that I have right now. Okay, but we're about 70% of the way through. Okay, there's still about 30% more to go for the settings, and then I'm going to spend a little time explaining why I chose the settings I did, and how it is in the field working with the camera. Okay. All right. Okay, so we're going to skip the movie menu, but these are the settings I use because I post-process my images, or I post-process my videos. We're going to skip all of this. We don't need any of this. Playback menu. I do use this, but I'm not going to talk about this. Just don't worry about anything in here. Okay, button operation. I made a lot of changes here as well. Okay, and this is where the function lever settings are also. So let's look at my button functions. I have the plus minus key, the exposure compensation button on the top of the camera set to C3 or custom mode 3. Record button, I leave that alone. ISO button, I've tried to leave as many buttons to their default setting as possible because I know a lot of people have muscle memory, and you know, I don't want to mess up your muscle memory. So I'm leaving the settings here as default as possible. Okay, so yeah, the EVF switch screen, the D-pad, I have it set to wait a minute. Yeah, the D-pad I have set to exposure. This is kind of irrelevant. I don't really use the D-pad that much when I'm taking pictures. I use the D-pad primarily for making changes in the menu. So you can change this to whatever you want. I don't have any preference there. Okay, on the front of the camera, you have these two buttons, right? I have C1 programmed to this button and C2 programmed to this button. And then everything else is default. I didn't make any changes anywhere else. So really the only change I made is this exposure compensation button is C3. And the two front buttons are C1 and C2. Okay? So what does that look like? Because we haven't even talked about C2 and C3 yet, right? We're just talking about C1. But C2 and C3 are just very minor variations of C1, but important variations. So what I want to be able to do is switch from C1 to C2 to C3 very quickly when I'm holding the camera. And how you do that is very important, okay? And we'll get into that. But those are my buttons. Those are the only buttons I changed. Everything else is the camera default settings or whatever you want them to be. But those are the ones for me. 1, 2, 3. Okay, C1 is bird in flight. Birds just flying around. You're taking pictures in SH2, continuous shutter. C2 is Pro Capture, primarily for bird on a stick, but you can also use it for bird in flight, but it's primarily bird on a stick. And then C3, which I have programmed here to the top, the exposure comp button, is yeah, bird on flight, bird on a stick. Wait, give me a second. I'm getting confused now. Hold on. Let me just look at it. C1, C2, C2. Yeah, that's bird on a stick. C3. Okay, I got it. C1, bird in flight. That's what I use the most, C1. C2, bird on a stick, or Pro Capture. Okay, C1 is bird in flight. C2 is Pro Capture, typically bird on a stick when you want to capture it flying off of the stick, right? And capture it in flight. So really it's a very, very minor variation of C1. C3 is bird on a stick. Okay, this is when you want to take a picture of the bird when it's just sitting there and not going anywhere. Because trust me, I've sat there for 30 minutes waiting for a frickin' bird to fly off their stick. And yeah, anyway, we've all been there, right? Sometimes they just sit there forever. A nuthatcher, okay? These birds are always moving around and twitching and flying, going back and forth. They're impossible. That bird was my nemesis for a long time. Okay, I could not get that bird. And then finally I got one. It was sitting on the tree, and I was like sitting there in pro capture waiting for him to fly off that stick. He sat there barely moving for at least 15 or 20 minutes. A nuthatcher. I never seen a nuthatcher just sit there. Anyway, C1, bird in flight. C2, catching a bird taking off, but it's pro capture. C3, bird on a stick. All right, let's go back to the settings here. Oh, let me put my lens cap back on. All right, so those are my button settings, dial settings. Okay, all we care about is manual mode. So manual mode, the dial settings can change with the lever setting. This is not right. This should be identical. So I need to fix this. So whether I'm in lever position 1 or lever position 2, it should be identical. Actually, oh, never mind. The reason I didn't change this, I'm sorry. The reason I didn't bother changing is because I changed the lever position function so that those settings are irrelevant. So what I mean by irrelevant is we're looking at these two settings here, right? This is lever position 1. And this is going to be the default setting, whether it's in lever position 1 or 2, based on another setting I'm going to change. So these are irrelevant over here. Okay. So basically you want the front and rear dial to be ISO and shutter. Whatever you prefer, if you want the front dial to be shutter and the rear dial to be ISO, you would just change this, okay, to shutter and then change this to ISO. Me personally, I like it the other way around. It's just personal choice, okay? But these two are non-negotiable. They have to be ISO and shutter. Lever position 2, the settings over here are not going to matter. And the reason being is we could ignore dial function for video, dial direction. We can ignore these settings, okay? Multi-selector settings, we can ignore this, but this is what I have them set to in case yours is not. This will go to home point, and this tells you to use the joystick to move the focus point around. Function lever settings, I have it set to mode 2. So mode 2 is basically it switches the autofocus mode and the autofocus target area. If I had this set to mode 1, this is where it changes the dial function. And that's where in the previous menu, it might have, this setting would make a difference in the previous menu, but because we're using mode 2, if we go back, dial function doesn't matter anymore because now it's going to be locked to ISO and shutter the way I have it set here. And when we're in lever position mode 2, these are irrelevant. But if you want, you can change these to be exactly the same. That's probably best practice. It'd probably be better to just make these the same. So I'm just going to do that real quick as part of my new settings. Even though it doesn't make any difference, I'm just going to go ahead and save that to C1. All right, so let's go back to function lever settings. So mode 2, this doesn't matter. And function lever, power lever, set this to function, so FN. Because you can set the function lever to turn the camera on and off. But we want it to actually work as mode 2. Electronic zoom settings are relevant. And you know, this locks the 2 top buttons on the top of the camera. So it locks these 2 buttons. There's no reason to lock or unlock them, so I just ignore that. Whatever the default setting's fine for these 2. And then let's see, in this live view close-up mode, I set this to mode 2 because I want the autofocus to work while I'm looking through the EVF in the live view. And the rest, prior to yes, I like this turn to yes, so I can delete things very quickly, or whatever settings. Generally, I want it to default to yes. But this, primarily I use this for when I delete the RAW file, I want it to delete the corresponding JPEG at the same time. But since we're not shooting JPEG, to me this setting's almost irrelevant, and you can ignore these, whatever the default settings are. Art view, these are relevant. I set mine to 60 Hertz because if you put it in auto, then it's going to try to figure out, and it might slow the camera down. So set it to whatever region your electricity is, 60 Hertz or 50 Hertz. I think European areas are mostly 50 Hertz, but here in the US it's 60. And selfie assist I turned off. If you're a content creator, you know, most of you guys leave this on, but you know, we're not content creators. We're primarily bird photographers, right? EVF style, I set the style 3. Because I have the HDMI plugged in, it's not going to let me show you, but style 3, that way I can see the maximum. This is also a better style for people that wear glasses because it makes the area, the viewable area, a little bit smaller and makes room for the fonts and things to be on the screen. And info settings, basically I have image only, but this is important. Information setting 1. I turn on highlight and shadow. Okay, this is critical. We're going to come back to this when we start talking about actually taking pictures. And then I turn everything else off. I don't need any of this stuff. I don't need, you know, when you're birding, you don't need a level gauge. You don't need to see your battery information, nothing. Right? And I don't care about the histogram either because we're using highlight and shadow. And then I turn the rest of these off. So now when I'm in my live view, when I hit the info button, I can see just the image, or I can see all the information here. Typically I have this screen on, and then when I push the shutter button, all that information disappears. Okay, so let's go back into the menu. And let's see. We were on page 3, 4, info settings. Info by half pressing. So when I half press the shutter button, this is what I meant. All that information goes away because now I'm trying to track the bird. And I don't want all these distractions in the frame. You know, when I half press the shutter button, I'm focusing on trying to capture the bird and get it within that frame. So that's why when I half press the shutter button like I am now, all that stuff just, you know, disappears from the screen. So it's less distracting when I'm trying to shoot birds. Again, this is personal preference, but this is what I do. Okay, so let's go back. Information settings and live view, same thing. This is the live view screen. I have image only and information. Level gauge I have turned on in the EVF because in the EVF the level gauge is very small. It doesn't interfere with the field of view. It doesn't block your view in any way. It's just at the bottom. And then I don't care about video. Okay, and then let's go to the next page, grid settings. Okay, so there are some significant changes here. Grid settings, I have it set to preset 2. I have grid setting turned off. But even though I have the grid setting turned off, this setting here, let's go to preset number 2. This setting still makes a difference. You may have noticed that my focus points, the lines on my screen, everything is in red because I don't want because you know the focus point and target area is always in green, right? So I turned it to red because when I'm changing the target area, it's green. But when I go back to my normal screen, it's here in red. So you see the the little area where C1, these are the C1 markers down here, this red one down here, and this. And then also the center weighted. You can eliminate this if you take it off center weighted. If you change it to like matrix metering, this will go away. I like it there, so that's why I put center weighted, because I like these little brackets here. But if you don't like these brackets, just change your metering mode on the control panel to matrix like this, and then you'll see that those little brackets are now gone. I just like them because it gives me a sense of where the center of the frame is, right? So that's why I have it turned on. But it doesn't make any difference in your exposure settings, okay? But you'll notice that everything is red. So let's go back here. I just like red because it's the opposite of green, right? So let me go over here. I'm sorry, grid settings, preset color 2. If I change this to another color, I wish they would just put color boxes here instead of making us put numbers. Because I don't know how a beginner would know what the heck this means. But this is green. This is like the default setting. But, oh, it didn't change. Hold on. You always have to confirm things here. Let me go back. Okay, so I'm going to make this green. There, now that should be set. Okay, now everything's green, but you see what I mean? To me, it's just a little confusing what I'm looking at sometimes. So I just like it in red, so I know that these are the target areas that I'm using. That's the center of the frame, and the green lines on the left and right are the frames of the frame of the sensor, right? So just a personal preference. So let's go over here. I'm going to change presets. So even though I have grids turned off, we'll just make it red. So now it's red. It's a very strong red. And then you can change the opacity so that you can see through it a little bit. Right here, grid settings, preset 2. I have it set to 75%. But this just changes it so you can see through it. You can make them very faint, or you can make them solid so that you can't see through it, like that. But I found 75%. But again, you know, you can change it to whatever you want. Okay, multifunction settings we'll ignore. Now, histogram settings, we have range here from 255 to 245. So I'm going to set it to the minimum ranges here, 245. And shadow is between 0 and 10. Okay, this is going to come into play when we start. These settings here affect, whoops, these settings here affect the settings here. You see where it says highlight and shadow? The highlight and shadow, these are blinkies when you start clipping highlights and shadows. The settings here that I changed, histogram settings, directly affect how much highlight and shadow clipping that we're going to see. So I minimized these, and I'll talk more about this when we get into the workflow and actually taking pictures. All right. Let's go to the next menu. Card slot settings I talked about before. This is the one that I use. And then nothing else here. Auto. One other thing I like to do is I edit the sRGB file name to manual, and I change it to OM-1 and then P. So OM-1 pictures is what that means. So that way, because I shoot with multiple cameras, so I can look at the file name and know that this image is from my OM-1. If you only have one camera, this doesn't really matter. But that's what I do. So I have EM5, OM1, OM3. When I look at the file name, I know right away. Okay, lens, yeah, we don't care about this. Copyright info, make sure that's turned on. I'll give you a little tip here though, is in the artist name, I put the current copyright year, 2026, and then I put my email. Just in case somebody honest wants to figure out, if I lose my camera and somebody honest can email me and say, hey, I found your camera, it could happen, because if I found somebody's camera, I would look at the exit date and see if I could find the owner, right? But yeah, good luck with that. And then copyright name, I just put my name and the year. But just a little tip there. Some people like to put their phone number in there instead, but I just put my email. Okay, all right. And then eye sensor settings. This is something that I may want to turn off going forward. So I'm going to save this to C1. This is something kind of new. This is something I've been kind of going back and forth on. Eye sensor settings. So let me explain this. You guys probably know what this is, right? Is when you put your eye up to the EVF turns on, and you can see what's in here. And then when you take the camera away from your eye, the LCD turns on, right? This is a problem in the field, because sometimes I'm like looking at my settings or something here, and then a bird flies up and I quickly want to, go up there. Sometimes it doesn't switch and it stays on the live view, and I don't see nothing when I'm looking through the EVF. That's I don't know why the auto function doesn't work right or the way I expected sometimes. So today, when I went out this morning, I turned the auto switching off so that it's always on the EVF. And then I close this down and I shoot with my camera with this closed when I'm out birding. Because too many times I put my camera up to my eye and it's blank in here. And I have to let go of the shutter button and tap it again, or I have to take the camera away from my face and bring it up again. I'm not sure exactly what's causing that. I mean, I kind of know, but I don't know for sure. It was just so annoying. So today, and this has been going on, I've been going back and forth on this for the last couple of weeks, whether to have this auto or on fixed, either look through the EVF or look at the back of the screen. Right now, I'm leaning towards just look in the EVF, change all your settings, do everything, and close this screen when you're birding. Because too many times I brought the camera up to my eye and I got a black screen. I couldn't see anything because it was still showing on the EVF, on the LCD. Okay. Okay, yeah, speaker on. We can ignore these settings. Airplane mode, I tend to turn this on when I'm in the field because it'll drain less battery. Otherwise, the Bluetooth is always running. Some people like to leave it on because they like to record their, whatchamacallit. Here we go, airplane mode. Some people leave this off. They turn the airplane mode off because they like to record their GPS information from their phone onto their camera. So again, personal preference, but I have it turned off just to conserve battery life as much as possible. Even if I only get a few more frames, those could be the keepers, right? And then let's see. Let's go here. Okay, Bluetooth is running. That's because I had airplane mode. And wireless shutter setting, we can ignore this because we don't use wireless shutter. So we can ignore all these. Okay, the next page, I'm going to ignore everything here. Battery and sleeping. If you really want to conserve batteries, you would turn quick sleep mode on. But yeah, just ignore this page. Whatever default settings, whatever you like, you can put in here. Doesn't really affect your birding. It really only applies to battery life. And then this last page here, nothing to do here other than, you know, firmware version, all that. Yeah, nothing there. And then these are my menu settings. Very simple. Sequential mode shooting, because sometimes I do want to shoot in another mode. But most of the time, those are the only two I need. Silent settings. Sometimes, you know, I need this. So these are my menu settings. Image review. If I'm doing bird on a stick or something, I like to turn image review on and off. So this shows the picture after you take it, right? And then night vision, sometimes I use because I do flash photography. I like to adjust the monitor brightness. I always have the monitor brightness set to +7 because outside is so bright, I can't see my screen. So I like this to be the brightest possible. I also like the EVF to be as bright as possible. Now, the images are going to look brighter in your EVF and LCD than when you come back and look on your computer. Then the images might look a little dark compared to what you were seeing in your EVF, but that's okay. The difference is not that big a deal. This is my personal preference. And then I have the erase hall here. Maybe I won't get into that today. I do use this a lot. Okay. I won't get into that today unless you guys want me to, but it's not that critical to birding. All right. So those are my C1 settings. All right. So those are all of my C1 settings. And I have the custom mode in C1 and I saved everything. Now, I have a C2 and C3. The C2 is bird is pro capture. So you're trying to capture a bird on a stick that's about to take off and fly, right? That's a typical use for pro capture. The only difference between C1 and C2 is I changed this to pro capture, SH2. So what I'm going to do, all right, right now I'm in C1, right? I'm in C1. So I'm just going to go into the menu. Whoops, I'm going to go into Super Control Panel. It was originally on SH2. I'm going to change this to Pro Capture SH2. And then I'm going to go to Menu, Page, Page 1, Camera Menu 1, Custom Mode, Set C2, Assign, and Set. That's all I do for C2. So I'm just going from C1 to C2. So all the button settings and everything are saved. So C1 is here, C2 is here. So if I'm doing, most of the time I'm just doing birds in flight and I'm using C1, but then the bird will land and I'm waiting for him to take off. Like a kingfisher, that's typical, right? They'll dive down. If they don't catch a fish, they'll go back up to their perch and then you just put it in the C2 and you wait for them. You wait for them to take off again, right? That's the only difference. C3 is the bird on a stick. All right, not pro capture, right? This is just simply the bird is up there. You're not trying to capture them taking off. All you want to do is take their picture. But C3, I changed the shutter speed to 1/800th of a second. All right. And this should be an auto ISO. Okay, auto ISO, 1/800th of a second. And I'm going to put this back into SH2. Those are my C3 settings. Okay, these are my C3 settings. 1/800th of a second, auto ISO, white balance, all of that. So go in here, custom mode, set C3, assign and set. I need to fix my C2. Sorry. Let's select Pro Capture, SH2, 1/3200th of a second, auto ISO. I'll go into the menu, custom mode, C2, assign, set, and then C1. C1 is just SH2. So menu, custom mode, C1, assign. All right, so that's C1, C2, C3, right? All right, now, as you saw, the only difference was really changing from SH2, between C1 and C2, SH2 to Pro Capture. Shutter speed 1/3200th of a second. That works for most of the bird and flight settings, regardless of the size of the bird. That said, the smaller the bird, the faster you want your shutter speed. So if we're talking about a little sparrow, right, you really want to be at 1/4000th, 1/5000th, as fast as you can possibly muster and get the proper exposure, particularly when they're flying because their wings flutter so fast. Pro Capture, same thing. 1/3200th of a second is fine for most birds, unless they get really tiny and they're really fast, like swallows. You want to be 1/4000th, 1/5000th. But I've captured a lot of small birds at 1/3200th of a second, and the wings are a little blurry because they're moving, right? But usually I get everything else pretty sharp. But sometimes it's not sharp. Sometimes there's motion blur because the shutter speed, even at 1/3200th of a second, is too slow for these small birds. Larger birds, you can probably get away with 1/2000th of a second. But you can adjust your shutter speed very easily, right? By, I forget what it was, front or rear dial. If I were to do muscle memory, it's a rear dial. I can adjust my shutter speed. So that's it between C1 and C2. SH2 or Pro Capture SH2. C3, you'll notice that, let me go into C3. You'll notice that C3, I'm at 1/800th of a second. So that's what? That's 2 stops slower. That gives you 2 stops more light. So ideally, you can save 2 stops on the ISO. So if you're originally at ISO 12,800, if you go to 1/800th of a second, you can be at ISO 3200 instead by lowering the shutter speed. Because if the bird is just sitting there on a stick, a lot of times blue herons, they sit there, forever. Hawks, sometimes they sit there forever, and you want to maximize your image quality. You slow the shutter speed down to 1/800th of a second, and that shutter speed is pretty safe for every focal length, every telephoto up to 500 millimeters. Okay, and again, I'm talking micro four thirds, 500, like the 150 to 400 with 1.25x. You're fine at 1/800th of a second with the image stabilization turned on for bird on a stick, and they're not flying or moving anywhere. I have gotten sharp images down to 1/125th of a second. So if I feel like I can get away with it, I'll lower the shutter speed down from 1/800th of a second. But right off the bat, C3 gives you 2 stops additional light from the other 2 settings very quickly. All right, now, that's basically why I chose those shutter speeds. And I see a question here about aperture. I'll come back to that. You also notice that Oops. You also notice that I have it set to ISO. It's set to auto. The reason being is when I switch from C1 to C2 to C3, the ISO is going to be whatever you set it to. You may not, and because you're changing shutter speed, you don't know what the ISO is going to be when you go out in the field. If it's midday bright sun, your ISO might be 200, 400, right? And if you go out towards the evening or you go out early morning, your ISO is going to be 6400. So auto ISO, when you switch from C1 to C2 to C3, auto ISO is going to be pretty close to the ISO that you're going to use anyway if you pick manually. But you do want to make sure you use manual ISO. You want to set the ISO manually. But auto ISO is a starting point for you when you're switching between those three custom modes. Otherwise, if you fix your ISO to say, let's say you set it to ISO 6400 just by default for whatever reason, for all three modes, right? Because we're shooting manual, then that might be too high of an ISO in the middle of the day. And if you're in a hurry, you switch to C2 and take a picture, you're at ISO 6400 because you didn't have time to switch the ISO when whatever thing was happening. So this is all about speed. So what I do is when I'm working fast and switching between C1, C2, C3, I don't want to have to try to calculate the ISO right away or dial it in right away. Even though I changed it so you can change it quickly, right? Remember, we had ISO set to full stops, right? So it goes 200, 400, 816. You can get to any ISO you want much faster. But auto ISO does generally a good job for that initial capture. But you do want to set your ISO to the light conditions that are in the field every time. So I'll go out and I'll take a picture in auto ISO and I'll push the play button. I'll see what it's set at. It might tell me, okay, it took it at ISO 3200. So I'll set it manually to 3200. But this is how I actually set my ISO in the field. And that's with the highlight shadows. Okay. So let me go back to my bird here. This setting here that we set in the display menu, where was that? Over here, right? Was it? It was in this menu, right? This highlight shadow is turned on. That's what's causing, see the little blue? That blue is telling me that the blacks are clipped based on the histogram settings that I just set at 245. And then I need a light. Here, I have a light right here. Single press, then long press. Okay, it's kind of a silly way to turn a light on. So here's the sun. See what I mean? This is clipped completely to white, right? All the data is lost. And then on the bird, you can see the bird is now clipping, right? So what I'll do is, I'm in auto ISO. What I'll do is I will dial in based on the clipping. I don't care about the background. All I care about is the bird. So now I can see that the bird is partially clipped in the wings. Oh, why did the light go out? Seriously. It's the battery. Let me get another light. I'll be right back. I can't demo this without a light. So, so right now, if I put this in auto ISO, right? This is the problem with auto ISO, is the bird is clipped, but I can change it very quickly. This is a little bit too strong. I'll have to increase my shutter until it's not clipped. Looks like this is going to clip no matter what. This is where I might actually adjust my aperture, but I rarely have to do that because rarely do you run across a scene like this. This light is terrible. Okay, so let me there. I'm going to increase the ISO until I get a nice balance in the shadows and the highlights. So right about there. So this is probably the setting I would use rather than the auto ISO. All right, now what just changed here? Okay. So this is what I try to do. I need to find a fixed light so I don't have to stand there with two. If you saw how I'm standing right now, you would be laughing. But if I lower the ISO down too low, you know, the shadow areas will start clipping too much. But I would probably pick, I'm going to increase the ISO until I start to see a little bit of red, then back it off a little bit. So for this scene, I'd probably shoot at ISO 6400. Let me lower my shutter speed back down. And I can lower my ISO. And there you have it. So this shot here, I would shoot at 1/3200th of a second, ISO 1600. So when I'm in the field, I have video actually. I was able to record a little bit. Let me see if I can find that real quick. Give me a second. That what I just showed you was kind of just a all right, hard drive's got to spin up. You know, that's kind of in the lab kind of thing, but in real life, this is what it looks like. I wish I could have recorded more, but the battery on my field recorder died. So second quarter. Hunley Meadows, yes. Was it yesterday or the first? I think, let me see. Yeah, so let me pause it here. So I'm doing bird on a stick type photography here. But you can see I don't really care about the highlights being clipped it back here. All I care about is this owl, right? And that it's perfectly exposed, and I don't care if the shadows here are clipped, because all I care about is the bird itself. And then let's see. I was doing some other stuff there. And then I have another clip here. Here's a clip. Oh, let's see. Yeah, here's a clip. So you can see that the sky is completely clipped, but I don't care because I want the bird to be properly exposed. So I am gradually, let me see if you see me changing. See, look. I'm adjusting the ISO here. So look here. Originally the camera was in manual mode at 1/125th, ISO 200, so I was probably doing some flash photography or something just before this. And then I switched to C1 right there. See, I switched to C1 very quickly, and it gives me these default settings. Right? 1/3200th of a second, ISO 6400 down here. And then I try to get the bird in my sights here. And the original settings, whoops, let's go back a little bit. when I go up to the bird, auto ISO is telling me 160. But now the bird is really underexposed, right? So now watch, I start to manually adjust the ISO until I get the exposure that I want. So I'm rolling it up, and now I got pretty much what I want. The bird is properly exposed, and like I said, I don't care if the sky is clipped, because what good is because I'm going to crop in anyway, right? So what good is the bird, the photo, if the bird is underexposed? So that's how I do it. I'll just let you watch this. It's kind of fun to watch. And see, now imagine if the bird went down here into the trees. You know what's going to happen, right? Auto ISO is going to overexpose the bird because the background is almost completely black, but the bird is mostly white. So now the bird's going to start clipping with auto ISO. But because I selected the ISO manually, the bird is going to be properly exposed no matter what. Whether he goes into the trees or if he goes into the sky, the bird is going to stay perfectly exposed no matter where he goes. In fact, I think what he did is he dove behind the trees and caught a fish. Of course, right? So I didn't catch him. Let's see, let me go out here. The autofocus lost him here. There, then he got him, and then seriously, he went behind this tree and caught a big giant fish, and then came back out and ate it somewhere behind another tree. I was pissed here. But you can see my ISO is fully manual here. Yeah, I was pissed. I started running here, trying to find him, because he went to another tree, and I was trying to get over there to get a shot of him, but then it was too far away. But that's kind of it. What I was doing in action, right? Is I'm using the highlight and shadow meters, like on the owl, to get the owl properly exposed. I don't care about anything else. And then I was using it for the osprey there, because I don't care about the sky clipping. I'm just trying to get the osprey properly exposed. And then no matter where the osprey went into the frame, he's always going to be properly exposed. And the way I used to do it, I used to use auto ISO, right? And it just dial exposure compensation. But that's kind of a guessing game, right? I knew from experience, that I need to dial in negative exposure comp for like egrets and things. Sometimes I would dial in -2 or -3. That osprey, I would have dialed in positive exposure comp, right? Probably +2 or +3. But it was kind of a guessing game, and sometimes I would come back and my exposures I was way off, right? Because I was just guessing. But using the highlight and shadows with manual ISO, and like I said, you can be within one stop. That's why I set it to one stop. You can very quickly get the correct exposure. But I use auto ISO sometimes. I have auto ISO as the default for C1, 2, and 3 because sometimes I don't have time to set it. I just need to get the shot. And auto ISO will get you pretty close. But when things start changing, like that osprey flying around, yeah, auto ISO is going to get very confused and give you the wrong exposure. So that's why I use full manual with highlight and shadow meters, again, based on the recommendation of the OM system ambassadors. And that's a big change from my best settings for birds in flight video that I did a couple of years ago. And I'm now getting much more consistent exposures. So I'll show you a few pictures and some examples. But there's one other setting that I need to talk about, and that's the lever position, right? So what you do is, right now I have it in lever position 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch the where is it? Right here. I'm going to switch the lever position 2 like this. So I'm in lever position 1. I'm going to switch to lever position 2. So watch what happens here. Where's my bird? I'm going to switch to lever position 2. Look at the green, look at the you see the center box here, the red one? I'm in single point. So before you save the custom one, what you do is you put the camera into lever position 1, go into the super control panel, and you want to set this to C1, right? So that's my C1. And then put this in the, now I put it in the lever position 2, and you want to change this to, and I'm just rotating the front dial, you want to change this to single. So lever position 1 is now this, lever position is this. Now you can save this to custom mode. What am I in? I'm in C3 actually, but now you can save this to C1, C2, like that. And those are, I think those are all the settings. I don't think I missed anything. Okay. So that's why I have the, that's why I start in auto ISO, but once I start taking pictures, I manually set it using the highlight and shadows. Then I can, now, right now, you have to be careful though, because now that I'm, if I have the mode dial in, yeah, I have it here in C1. Right now, if I push the buttons here, C1, C2, C3, nothing changes because the mode dial is locking everything to C1. It's locked. So even if I push C2 or I push C3, none of the settings are going to change. It's not going to switch to C2 or C3. So what I do is, this is also important, is I put the camera into C1. I'm sorry. I'm going to put the camera into, I'm going to put the camera into P mode. Okay? I'm going to start here. And then I'm going to go into the menu. I'm going to go into custom mode. Click on that. Click on C1. And I'm going to click on recall. Don't do this. Don't go to set. You want to click on recall and say yes. Okay? Now I'm going to put the camera into aperture priority. I'm going to go into the menu, custom mode, whoops, I'm sorry, C1, recall, yes. Now I'm going to put the camera into manual mode. So I'm in manual mode now, or I'm sorry, shutter priority now, right? I'll eventually get to manual. Go into the menu, custom mode, C1, recall, yes. And then I'm going to put the camera into, now I'm in manual mode. Go into the menu, custom mode, C1, recall. Now, what have I just done? When the camera is in aperture priority mode, let's say I'm in A mode, and I go in here and I say custom mode, C1, recall. If you remember, custom mode 1 actually has, I had the shutter speed set to 1/3200th of a second, right? That's the only thing that's not going to be set, because whatever is on the mode dial here, whatever the mode dial is, takes priority. The mode dial overrides all your custom settings based on the mode it's in. So you'll notice that because I'm in aperture priority, the shutter speed is going to be calculated by the camera, but everything in here, right? Everything else in the control panel and all the settings that we did, all the button settings, the highlight shadows, everything else will be the same. Auto ISO, white balance, metering, everything is the same. So that's what's happening when I'm recalling custom mode 1 into P, A, S, and M. Now I'm going to put the camera, this is what you want to do when you go out in the field, is you want to put the camera into manual mode. And go into the menu. This is what you do every time. Go into custom mode, C1, recall. Whoops. Let me do that one more time. Custom mode, C1, recall, yes. Now if we look at the settings, look what we have here. All the settings for C1, right? Now if I'm going to go into C2, let me put my cap back on. I don't want to give anybody a seizure. All right, now that we're in C1, if I want to go to C2, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push C2 button here, and then I'm going to push the C3 button. So I'm going to push the C2 button. Now C2 is recalled. Really the only change here is that we went into Pro Capture, right? So we're in C2. If I want to go into C3, I'll push the C3 button, and now you can see that we're at 1/800th of a second. SH2, bird detect, C1, lever position, and I can quickly go from C1, I'm going to push C1, C2, I wonder if I can put my face here. So yeah, so C1, C2, C3. I can quickly change like that while I'm in the field. Now if I push C3 again, it's going to go back to whatever the settings were in manual mode, but that's why I recalled C1 at the beginning, is because I want everything in manual mode to be C1. That's going to be my default setting. But I'm going to, now you have to be careful. Watch this. If I change this to some ridiculous number, like 1/320th of a second, and I push C1, okay, C1, right, now we have 3200th of a second, but if I push C1 again, it's going to go back to manual mode, and it's going to remember what I said in manual mode, where you can see the shutter speed is now back down to 1/320th of a second. So be very careful here, but you have to do it this way if you want to quickly switch between, say, SH2, Pro Capture, and Bird on a Stick. If you want to switch quickly between these three, you have to put the camera into manual mode. Because if I put the mode dial into C1, if I push C2, nothing's happening. If I push C3, nothing's happening because the mode dial is locking everything because it's in C1. Same thing for C3. If I put this into C3, if I push C1 button, nothing changes. So that's why you have to go into manual mode, like so, right? Go into the menu, custom mode, C1, recall, yes. The other thing you have to be careful is if I go into the menu and come back out, it's now back into regular manual mode. You see M over here? There's no C1 next to it. Now there's C1. But if I go into the menu for any reason and come back out, it now goes back into manual mode. So just be very conscious of that, because I've caught myself a couple of times where, for whatever reason, I was shooting at like some ridiculous shutter speed and some weird ISO like this, ISO 100. I was in manual mode. I was doing flower photography or something. Then I went over to do birds, and I pushed my C1, and I started doing some birds. But somewhere along the way, I accidentally went into the menu. Well, not accidentally, but I went into the menu to say use the erase all, or I pushed the play button, right, to look at my pictures. And now it's back in the manual mode, and the shutter speed has dropped back down to 1/320th. And sometimes I forgot to push the C1. So that's how it is on my OM-1, okay? So just be very conscious that you push C1, C2, C3. You have to be very, very deliberate, because anything can knock it out of C1, 2, 3, right? Going into the menu, pushing the play button, toggling C1 and C1 and toggling C1 button a couple of times, and you can be in and out of regular manual mode versus C1, or custom mode. So that's a workflow issue that I ran into in the field, right? Is I was like, oh, why is my shutter speed at 1/100th of a second, and why is my aperture at f/22? Because I wasn't in C1 anymore, because somehow I pushed the menu button or whatever. Now what you can do is save all of those settings on OM Workspace, or like I did in my phone, using the OM system app. You can see I have OM-1, C1, 2, 3, 4 for birds. I have the bird icon there. And then OM-1 for work, because I do, architectural stuff. I have different C modes for that. Then my OM-3, I'm still working on this. The OM-3 is a whole different workflow because it doesn't have as many buttons, right? All right, so let me look at the chat section, and we'll look at some we'll look at some pictures, give you some real life examples. One of my PenFs won't change from screen to EVF. Sometimes it does change. So what you want to do on your PenF is clean the eye sensor. Okay, there's a little, you'll see where's my PenF? I haven't used it in so long. Here it is. Okay, right here, this little black thing, you need to clean that. Right here, this thing. This little black thing right here. Clean that. If that doesn't do it, then the eye sensor is going bad. Like on my EM10 Mark II, the eye sensor went bad, and I had to manually change everything. And hi, Rob. EVF does not turn on sometimes because syntactic material on your shifter jacket. Oh, okay. Maybe. Whatever the reason, thank you for that. That makes sense, right? I think you meant to say because of the synthetic material on your shirt or jacket. Could be anything. That's as good a reason as any. I don't doubt it. But yeah, I'm just struggling sometimes. And keep those thumbs up. Oh, thank you. So you never really mess with aperture, right? Because my shutter speeds are so high, 1/3200th of a second, 1/4000th of a second. I just leave the aperture wide open. I need as much light as possible into the camera. The only time I mess with aperture is like when I'm doing close-up photography and macro work, right? Then I want f8, f11, those kind of settings. But for birding, wide open, all day, all the time. And Kevin, good to see you, Kevin. And the Odd Pro says, I have my C1 set to S mode now. How can I change it to M mode? I can't seem to change it. Okay, so exactly, right? What you want to do is do what we just did. How come? Turn the camera on. Okay. So first, put your camera into M mode. Then go into the menu. Okay. Go into custom mode, C1, recall, and yes. And then assign. I'm sorry. And then, yeah. And then go into the menu, custom mode, C1, assign. Like that, and set. So that'll take all of your settings that you had in C1 under aperture priority and resave them under manual mode. Just be sure to set your shutter speed though to what you want when you're in manual mode. So that's all you need to do. So take the mode dial off of C1, put it into manual mode, recall C1, and then set your shutter speed and save C1. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Heather says, stupid question, when you're in C1 and want to change aperture, do you need to go into, yes, you would have to go in the super control panel. But like I said, it's very rare. Very rare. If I made a mistake somewhere in my initial settings, I did have to go in and change it. Particularly with variable zoom lenses, sometimes the aperture is not right because I didn't save it right when I did it the first time. But yeah, short answer is yes. Go in the super control panel to change. And you may want to save it to C1. If that's the aperture you want to use going forward, save it to C1. But I can't think of any reason you wouldn't shoot wide open all the time for birds in flight, pro capture, and bird on a stick. Maybe I should have said, when your front dial is set to ISO, how do you change the aperture on the fly? You cannot. You have to go in the super control panel. I'm trying to think. Because we forced the lever position to change the target point, can't use that. I can't think of any other way to do it other than through the super control panel. So now I'm looking for an OM-1. Cool. And yes, I'm still, how long have I been on? I don't even know. Rob, do you do street snapping in P mode? No, I typically do street in manual now, right? Because the only difference being is I use the shutter speed is much lower than it would be for birds. If not manual, then I would do aperture priority because I want creative control over the depth of field. Sometimes I want to see everything in focus, like with architectural and buildings. I'll shoot an aperture priority. And if it's low light, I have to be on a tripod. So it's a lot of different, street photography is totally different. I rarely use P mode. Very rare, almost never. I can't think of the last time I used P mode. The only time I use P mode is when I want somebody else to take a picture of the group and that person doesn't know anything about a camera. I'll put it in P mode, okay, take a picture of us. And it does a good job. I mean, P mode works fine, right? But I'm very, very particular about my settings for all the photography that I do. So that's why I don't use P mode. P mode to just concentrate on composition. No, like I said, I'm very particular about my settings. I want a very specific aperture, very specific shutter speed if I want to show motion blur or not. And ISO. I'm very particular about all my settings now when I take a picture to get exactly what I want. And thank you so much, Whiplash. I really appreciate the super chat. That's awesome. Okay, any other questions? So It takes a little while sometimes for the questions to kind of come up. Can you set the multifunction switch instead of using the super control panel? I don't think so. I don't think under the, let's take a look. I don't think under the multifunction settings, where is that? Multi-selector. It's not that. That's not the multifunction. Button settings. So let's change the ISO button. Well, let's change the record button to multifunction. There it is. So now the record button is multifunction. And then the multifunction settings are where? Probably in the first menu. Let me look. Oh, it's not there. Where is it? Is it in here? There it is, multifunction settings. So you have color, ISO, magnify. Yeah, I don't see a way. And the question was, can you set up multifunction switch? I mean, if you're referring to changing aperture, no. I don't see aperture as an option in here. You have ISO and white balance, but I don't see aperture. Okay. I think of P as old school. Okay, so let me show you a few of the pictures. Like we were doing this video on this osprey, right? I have a picture of this, not this particular osprey. And I invite you to look at my settings here. So I think you're seeing, yeah. All right, so these are all very recent, but let's look at this bird in flight one here. This is an egret, and you can see my settings here. 1/3200th of a second, and I manually set the ISO to 1250. Let me enlarge this. I have all my EXIF data here. And if you want to know how much I cropped on an image, you can click on this down arrow, and you can see the original size is 46, whatever, 4367 by 3285. That's the original size of the image. So I cropped in a little bit because originally the height is what, 3,888. So I only cropped in a tiny bit. And I got really good detail because there was hardly any cropping there. Here's mallard in flight. And this one you can see my shutter speed is this, and I set my aperture to, my ISO to 1600. Aperture just wide open at f5.6. This is the M5 Mark II. This camera doesn't have a way to assign ISO to one of the dials. Not that I could find. It's been a while since I've used that old menu system, but I couldn't find how to assign ISO to the dial. So I had to shoot in shutter priority. But anyway, EM5 Mark II, 75 to 300. And this time I slowed the shutter speed way down to 1/640th just to keep the ISO as low as possible. But it came out really good. This is a really nice shot. You can see this poor barn swallow has an eye plucked out here. But great detail. And this is the old EM5 Mark II with the 75 to 300. Again, I was able to dial in manually some really good settings for this. And you really don't want to go below 1/800th of a second, 1/640, generally speaking, because you know, you want to avoid motion blur as much as possible from camera shake. EM5 Mark II again, 75 to 300. Good lighting here. This one in flight, okay, the OM-1. So this is a really small bird, so I bumped my shutter speed just a tiny bit. 1/4000th of a second, and I kept my ISO at 1600. This one here, bird on a stick. Now, I was probably in mode C2, Pro Capture. So that's why I'm at 1/3200th of a second. So even though this is a bird on a stick, I was waiting for this bird to take off. So I was probably in Pro Capture, and this is one of the frames from the Pro Capture. Here's the owl that I had in the video earlier. Yeah, this is where I dialed in 1/125th of a second because it was dark. And I'm still at ISO 1600. But it still came out pretty sharp. There's a tiny bit of motion blur in the feathers because there's a little bit of a breeze. Plus he's breathing. But I think this came out pretty good. And then here's that osprey that I showed you earlier in the video. I'm pretty sure it was this guy. Yeah, it was one of these frames. It was a frame from one of these shots here. This came out great. And again, 1/4000th of a second, ISO 3200. So I probably could have dropped the shutter speed a little bit, but I was waiting for the osprey to dive, right? And when they're diving and they splash in the water, there's a lot of movement there, and I wanted to freeze it. So that's why I dialed in a little bit faster shutter speed. But I'd probably been okay at 1/3200th of a second. Here's another one of the same osprey. You know, this just came out. I over sharpened a little bit. I tend to do that. But yeah, I'm still at 1/4000th. You know, I just wanted to be sure that I could freeze the action of him diving into the water, getting the fish. Same settings. So you can see once I have the settings dialed in, I don't really have to change them because the lighting doesn't change. No matter where this osprey goes, if the osprey goes down near the water or he goes up into the sky, I'm always going to have the right exposure on the osprey, and I don't have to worry about auto ISO or fiddling with exposure comp and getting it wrong. Let's see, this one here. Again, I was probably doing Pro Capture and, you know, ISO 12800. It's kind of crazy. This one here, this was a Pro Capture shot, right? 1/3200th. I dialed in ISO 6400. So I'm doing this is what I've been doing for the past 30 days is tweaking my settings to get to this point. But now my results, I mean, I think the results speak for themselves. They're pretty solid every time. I love this shot. I love these red-winged blackbirds. Just the little red accents on this blackbird, and they're tough to do. They're challenging because they're a black bird, right? But I used the highlight shadow metering, right? And I made sure there weren't too many blue shadows on the bird, and I was able to expose him properly. Same thing with this egret. I was probably in Pro Capture, but I got, you know, I didn't clip any of the highlights. All of the highlights got saved. And I got wonderful detail in the feathers. A little bit of motion blur here, but just tack sharp. Now this is heavily cropped, but you can see this is why I chose 1/4000th of a second, because this guy was about to go in. And he ended up catching this tiny, tiny little fish. I'm not sure if this is the same time. I think this one was the day before. No, it might be the same shot. Same bird. But you can actually see the little lens of, they have the osprey have this lens that cover their eyes when they go in the water. You can see the little lens coming back in this little tiny fish that he caught. This is the EM5 Mark II with the 75 to 300. This is my bird in a stick settings. If I was at 1/800th of a second, it's only a third of a stop difference. But I slowed it down as much as possible. This is the EM5 Mark II and 75 to 300. Again, I kind of tweaked it down as low as I felt comfortable. Because again, I'm at 300 millimeters. So that dictates I should have probably 1/600th of a second shutter speed. But I was just trying to squeeze every bit of information that I could. But even like this 10-year-old camera, this more than 10 years old now, with a 10-year-old lens, still can give you great results. EM5 Mark II, 75 to 300. These are like bird on a stick kind of settings, right? This is probably my OM-1, yeah. Here you can see I dialed down just a little bit. So I do have some motion blur, just a little bit. I over sharpened it as usual. But you can see, yeah, there's just a tiny bit of motion blur around the eyes and the beak. It's not quite as obvious as when I was looking at the raw file. And here we are, 132. So, I'm just dialing in C1 and dialing in my ISO. Same thing here. But you get the idea. You guys can go to my, oh, here's another shot of that owl. So yeah, this is where I had the 1/800th of a second, ISO 6400. And I'll try and pull up the raw images so you can see I'm not kidding around. These are actually the settings I used, and I got a decent exposure. Oh, that's a pano I did. Oh, I love this shot. I dialed in 1/4000th. Yeah, you can see this is April 28th. I originally had the C1 set to 1/4000th of a second. You don't really need that fast a shutter speed, especially for birds like this, right? The blue heron. So I said, let me just dial it back to 1/3200th of a second, just to squeeze another third of a stop of light for our ISO settings. I just really wanted to maximize the image quality best I can. Okay, there's that osprey again, 1/3200. I dialed in ISO 800. These guys are tough. I was trying to do this today on an EM5 Mark III. It was hard. But you can see 1/3200th of a second. Even for these little tiny swallows, 1/5000th would have been better. There's just the tiniest bit of motion blur in these guys. It would have been a little sharper if I had my shutter speed a little faster. Bird on a stick, what was I at? 1/16. Yeah, those weren't, I could have done better on the settings there. Beautiful egret. Look at that. I was able to go down to ISO 100 on that guy. So I was probably waiting for him to take off, so I was probably in pro capture. I think I did get some shots of him taking off. Bird on a stick, but I was pro capture. So I was at 1/3200th of a second. I was waiting for him to take off. So there's some examples. Hopefully you guys saw all that. And Odd Pro, thank you so much. I really appreciate the support. I'm glad you guys are finding this valuable and worthy of your super chats and donations. I have donation links down below as well. Buy me a coffee, all that good stuff. I'm going to try and make a video where it's a little bit more concise, but I won't be able to go in as much detail and answer questions live like I am now. So I might have to do this again. Maybe I'm going to program the OM-3 next. The core settings will be identical. The only difference is going to be the workflow and the buttons. So I might have to do C1, C2, and C3. Use the AF on button to C3. But I think other than that, there won't be any difference. And Roger says, great bird shots. Thank you. Thank you. And Heather says, did you figure out the blur we were discussing Friday? At first I thought it was motion. Then you were thinking it was some setting. So if I remember, you were at like 1/4000th of a second or something on that shot. Yeah, I mean, you were at a shutter speed. There should not be any motion blur. So it can only be two other things, right? Either image stabilization jitter, or it is slightly out of focus. The problem is, if it was slightly out of focus, I would expect haloing in all directions, right? Because out of focus is out of focus. It doesn't care what direction. Whereas image stabilization jitter, I feel like that, because that haloing was in one direction only, on top of the bird, nowhere else, but just along the top edges and a little bit along the sides. Versus something out of focus, you would think it'd be out of focus top, bottom, left, right. It would be out of focus in 360-degree direction, right? But this was not out of focus in 360 degrees. It was out of focus at 180, like everything in one direction, kind of. So I haven't figured it out. Long story short. Oh, absolutely. Oh, thank you. The great Vanzini. I appreciate that. So I don't know, but gosh, how long have I been online? I can't tell. Let me see if there's any timer here. No. Oh, 3 hours. Jeez. Anyway, those are my settings. I know that was really long, 3 hours, but hopefully I don't think I missed anything. It's going to be like a 30 or 40-minute video if I have to make a video about this. Minimum to go through all the settings and explain why I do the settings I do. I'm also going to give the download links so you can just load them onto your camera directly if you have an OM-1 Mark 1. I don't think it'll work if you have an OM-1 Mark 2 or anything else, unfortunately. So for those of you that have any other camera, the Mark 2 or the OM-3, you're going to have to, well, the Mark 2, if you have the Mark 2, you're going to have to just manually put these settings in. Okay, so if no other questions, we will call it here. So you guys, thank you so much for watching today. And if you found the video helpful or the stream helpful, you know, donations are always welcome. Buy me a coffee, are greatly appreciated. I'll be back. What is today? I don't know if I can make it Tuesday. I have to go to some appointments this week. So streaming next week might be a little limited, but I'll be back as soon as I can. Let's just say that, because I really enjoy doing this and helping as many people as I can and sharing, you know, what I do. But you guys, I'll be back soon. You guys have a great day. Try to do that every day. You'll have a good life, right? Eat healthy and exercise. And I hope to see you guys all again soon.